listening to the Paul McGuire Report. I'm Paul McGuire. Today's program is one of the most important programs I've ever done. I'm not saying that for some kind of emotional, theatrical effect. I'm saying it because it's true. I believe you know it's true. That's why you're listening to the Paul McGuire Report. We have never seen, I don't care how old you are or how young you are, here in America, and I need to talk about America very specifically today, because what happens in America is going to hit the rest of the world like a geopolitical, economic, social tsunami. So for those of you that are listening or watching in the many different continents and nations, where so many of you are regular listeners and watchers of the Paul McGuire Report, our prophetic emergency alerts, readers of my books all over the world. But I have to zero in, and everything that's happening all over the world is of vital significance. Each region has its own set of unique problems. But right now I have to talk about America because, to be blunt, for those of you listening in all the other nations across planet Earth, this is not about America being better than any of the nations that you live in. It's simply that if America falls, there is going to be a tidal wave of impact on all the nations of the world. It is not an accident that the globalist elite, the Luciferian elite, have targeted America so intensely for destruction at this time period. The reason America is experiencing this endless series of assaults, this is really not all that hard to figure out. Many of you have already figured this out. Probably most of you who listen to this program on a regular basis understand what I'm talking about. You figured this out. But the people you communicate to, the people you influence, even the people who insult you and call you a conspiracy theorist or whatever, you know what? I'm not just saying this. I don't care if I'm called a conspiracy theorist, because that's just the word. The only question is the conspiracy theory true? Is there enough evidence behind at least the questions to implore us into further investigation? And many times, I mean, there's some crazy conspiracy theories out there. You avoid them, you ignore them. But we're not talking about a conspiracy theory. We're talking about what is happening right before our eyes. So if America falls, this will allow Satan, literally, to bring his demonic clouds of spiritual deception and darkness and oppression across the entire earth. Oh, I just wish, I know, because I meet so many people here in the United States, and I had a theory that this was true. When I used to do the Paul McGuire show for 10 years, which was a nationally syndicated show, 4 hours, live, drive time, Monday through Friday, in every major market in the United States and some major markets in Canada, huge cities in Canada like Vancouver. And the show aired more than that, because many of the stations would play 3 hours of the show, and then they'd play another 3 hours of the show. So just in the state of California alone, the Paul McGuire show aired on 2 radio stations, but those 2 radio stations covered every nook and cranny, every town, city, and area of the entire state of California was blanketed between these 2 stations. The Paul McGuire show, its guests and its message, would sometimes be on the air. I'm talking about, this went on for 10 years, for 6 hours, from like Sacramento all the way up to Northern California. That would include San Francisco, Silicon Valley, half of California, Northern California, Central California, half of it was listening to the Paul McGuire Show 6 hours a day. And this is catching the commuters going in and out of Oakland and San Francisco. It was phenomenal, the impact we had. And then they would play 3 hours again on a Saturday or a Sunday, or both a Saturday and Sunday. And many other stations played the Paul McGuire Show, not just 3 hours, but they would play it 6 hours, because they would play it, and then they'd play another 3 hours. So we had soccer moms, and the advantage of hosting a program in the state of California and other states is California is always having a massive traffic jam. So you have a captive audience of people that are stuck in traffic, commuters and soccer moms and stuff. In addition, when the numbers of people began to explode listening to the Paul McGuire Show, we were technologically at the place when the show first began. Not everybody had cell phones. When for the 10 years of the show, people basically, when they were in their cars, were listening to AM or FM, and we were on AM and FM stations. Some would be listening to a tape or a DVD of music. But very few at that time had access to like earbud technology and all the technologies that people have today to disconnect via their cell phone or Bluetooth or whatever system and kind of be in their own world. No, we had a captive audience because those technologies were not yet emergent. And we talked about these kinds of things and intense things and biblical things, et cetera, et cetera. My point is that I was functioning as a watchman on the wall for that time, before that time, and before that time. And millions of Christians, especially, because where our station was located was in Costa Mesa, California. And for example, just in our California market, we would hit cities like, of course, San Francisco and LA, et cetera, but San Diego, which I believe is the sixth largest or fifth largest city in the United States, and it's larger than most nations in the world. We blanketed San Diego. And we warned about everything that is happening now on television, on radio. I mean, I'm talking about today in 2020. Everything that you see happening in the streets now, I warned about. This isn't bragging. This is factual, my factual track record. Okay? I began to warn about this in articles and my earlier books and national articles and radio interviews going back 40 years. I was warning about what is happening today in the streets of America, the riots, the demonstrations, the organizers, the social upheaval. I was warning about biological warfare, mass mind control, globalism, trade treaties. I was warning about this for 45 years. I just didn't jump on this bus 5 years, 2 years, 1 year, 10 years, 20 years ago. I jumped on the bus actually when I was 15 years old and lived in it and was miraculously saved out of the counterculture. That gives me, by God's grace, a very unique perspective. Because everything you're seeing, I put up on my Facebook pages. And by the way, before I forget, I need you to do this. If you want to partner in getting this message out, this is not about me. I could give a hoot about me. Really. I'm not going to be around forever. I'm going to be in heaven. All right? I'm not planning upon leaving this earth anytime in the near future. I've already told God what I want. I believe I have a call to be here. Okay? And so I'm not planning on going anywhere. But the point is, I'm not Johnny come lately. That's the point I want to make. All right? I got miraculously saved. I say approximately because in those days, those were the wild and crazy 60s, and you've heard that expression, that dumb expression. If you can remember the 60s, you weren't there. Well, we were all so high and stoned and stuff that we really didn't pay attention to calendar years. And as you know, my major was a dual major, filmmaking, at the University of Missouri, and altered states of consciousness, a brand new field in the psychology department. And what was interesting is that when I went to the University of Missouri, I thought Christians were like, there was that time, it was either Time or Newsweek came out with the Jesus movement. And I just went into a tirade of anger when I saw the cover of Time or Newsweek with the Jesus movement, because I thought that the counterculture revolution that I believed in, that these Jesus freaks would send us back into the Stone Age. I really did. I thought that. I hated Christians. Then I was miraculously saved, fleeing from a denominational Christian religious retreat an hour outside of the University of Missouri in a supernatural experience which can only be described as like a field of dreams experience, which you can hear. Go into the archives of Paul McGuire, the Paul McGuire Report. Go into all the free articles. I've told that testimony has reached millions and millions and millions of people in the United States and worldwide. Because by God's grace, so many doors have been opened up through magazines like that would reach 1 million people globally, Christian television networks, powerful Christian ministries, powerful Christian publishing houses, Fox News Network, History Channel, so many outlets that Sid Roth, who did a whole reenactment of my testimony. So I thank God for that. But this is not about me. It's never been about me. I can tell you something that flashes back in my mind right now, how the Holy Spirit gripped my heart, gripped my mind at the earliest ages. And then after I was miraculously saved, this same Holy Spirit of God has supernaturally directed my footsteps, my research, my writing, and has used me prophetically in a very powerful way. But I'm not judging anybody else. I decline the title prophet because of theological reasons. That doesn't mean I don't have prophetic gifts. That doesn't mean God doesn't use me prophetically. But I cannot, and again, I'm not judging others. I'm not comfortable with my study of the Bible that the qualifications for an authentic biblical prophet is 100% accuracy, or you're to be stoned to death. Now, given that weighty accountability by God, I can't say that every prophetic statement I've made has been 100% accurate. And by the way, I do not know of any human being alive today or any Christian leader alive in human history, with the exception of the apostles and Jesus Christ, or the Old Testament prophets like Joshua and Isaiah and Ezekiel, Joel, whose prophecies Joshua was not really categorized as, quote, a prophet, but the other prophets of the Old Testament, 100% accuracy. I don't know of any man or woman who is even close to 100% accuracy in their prophecies. That means they're fallible, as I'm fallible. And see, that's why, and I'm not here to knock Catholicism, that's why I can't embrace the theological tenets of Catholicism, because I can't elevate any man, such as the Pope. The Pope is fallible. This particular pope is extremely fallible, because this particular pope, and I'm not trying to attack him, I'm simply analyzing what he has been promoting verbally, and he's promoting Marxism and socialism and globalism. He's not promoting biblical Christianity. Earlier popes, to a far larger degree, promoted biblical Christianity. That's not being done. We're not supposed to follow men. Okay, we follow the Word of God. Now, we see the intensity of the battle on the streets, but this battle is a battle that has been carefully thought out, carefully planned, carefully financed, carefully organized. One thing you will learn about Marxists and socialists, and like I said, God supernaturally leads my research, guides my research, and in an amazing way, and it's based on grace, unmerited favor, God leads me to meet people. God leads me into situations and environments and places which I could never have maneuvered myself into, because many times God, given my call, God places me in places where I get access to information that other people don't know about, and God supernaturally opens doors, even in what appears to be mundane, regular activities. So, for example, I have to be very discreet, but through a series of miraculous, when I say miraculous, there weren't fireworks going off. For all purposes, it appeared like a normal conversation or a normal seminar, but it wasn't. God put me there to gain information. And I became aware of the fact that this was decades ago. I bought into, like many people in my generation, I stopped using the word, I wouldn't use the word communist, Marxist, socialist, because that sounded like McCarthyite hysteria. And so I bought into the lie that you shouldn't use those words, and I began to use the communist, seeker-friendly words like progressive and liberal. But about 20 years ago, I said, this is nonsense. What we're really talking about is communism, Marxism, socialism. So I began to use those words long before their understanding, which is now having a rebirth in our society. But what I learned was that in, for example, the educational system of the United States of America, that not only are there very powerful groups that control the content of education and the curriculum, but there are very powerful Marxist, communist, hard socialist groups which present themselves like they're going to feed people from poor families or lunch programs or whatever. And there's a vast army that's highly organized, highly deceptive, that has penetrated schools all across the United States of America, especially grammar schools and secondary schools and high schools and colleges, universities, and preschool centers. But there's a Marxist network that has been recruiting, training, planning for decades. Now, I would blow the trumpet as a watchman about this regularly for years, trying to wake up Christian leaders. And God put me in the unique office of opening the door for me to be the #1 radio talk show host to the largest Christian market initially in the entire world, which is Southern California and then California. Because Southern California is the Mecca of evangelical Christianity. Collectively, there are more megachurches, celebrity pastors, best-selling Christian authors, best-selling Christian musicians, a very large number of evangelical denominations, a very large number of giant and prestigious evangelical seminaries and colleges, and Christian television networks and Christian radio stations and Christian ministry headquarters. There's an amazing amount and percentage of Christian ministries located in just Southern California alone. And when the Paul McGuire Show began, where the station is, it broadcasts a very powerful signal, radio signal, into the environment where all these mega churches are, all these mega ministries are, all these Christian organizations are. God allowed me to communicate to the Mecca, to the global headquarters of evangelical Christianity. And what would be interesting is that it was evident that the vast majority of the megachurch pastors and the large pastors were secret listeners of my program. But they didn't want to call because of insecurity. I think that's sad, because they were afraid that I was always polite to my guests, but they were afraid that I might ask them a question and they didn't want to look. And I wasn't about trying to make them look dumb, but they were afraid that they would, so they kind of hid. But I knew that the majority of the people in their congregations were listening to that they were preaching to their people, 2 or 3 hours a week. I was preaching to their congregations 5 days a week, 3 hours a day. And so whether or not some of the pastors wanted to acknowledge my existence, their people were addicted to the Paul McGuire Show. Now, there were some notable exceptions among the pastors who would come on. And you'd be surprised. I don't agree with everything that the author of The Purpose-Driven Life, I forgot the pastor's name. Oh, Rick Warren. Rick Warren, I don't agree with it, all of his theology and stuff. But I will say this about Rick Warren. He was one of the few pastors of perhaps the biggest megachurch in Southern California, the biggest national name at that time. And yet he called, and it's not just that he called the program that was important. He didn't seem to care about, was he going to look good? Was Paul McGuire going to ask him a tough question? He was willing to risk. That requires a certain amount of humility. So he just got up and called. But that was rare. Now, again, I don't agree with everything the man says, but that reflects a transparency and an integrity. Now, I'm sure he didn't agree with a lot of what I said and taught, but his people were listening because they were stuck in the cars. And then the head of the Calvary Chapels, Pastor Chuck Smith, was a regular listener of my program and a regular guest. And other very notable pastors, I mean Jack Hayford and many others, who would listen to the program. And then many national Christian leaders, like Dr. James Dobson, would come on the program regularly, and Shirley Dobson, his wife, and my friend Tim LaHaye, who has now gone on to be with the Lord, was constantly on the program, as was his wife. Others, there's so many other Christian leaders. Pat Robertson was on, thunderously defending me. Thunderously. And Dr. G. James Kennedy, thunderously defending me. Why were they defending me? Because I aggressively, not angrily, but I aggressively warned the Christian leaders, the Christian seminaries, the Christian pastors, the ordinary Christians, that if they did not stand up in a spiritual manner and begin to stand up for biblical truths and win people to Christ and have faithfulness in reading the entire Word of God, that the forces of secularism and humanism and socialism and Marxism, and most of all, this globalism, that it was going to rise up and literally persecute, and its goal, and that they needed to really open their eyes, that its goal was to destroy the church and to destroy Christianity. I was warning that to millions of people day after day after day. Now, I didn't share that to pat myself on the back. I shared that to communicate to you that I have been committed to this cause for at least 40 years. And the burden of knowing the truths that I know, and others know them too. Many of you know what I'm talking about. And there are many good Christian leaders and many good Christian pastors and many good heads of Christian ministries and many ordinary Christians who know a lot of this stuff like you do. But let's be honest among ourselves, it is a burden, especially when so many Christians around you, and of course the secular world, is always taunting, always cynical, always innuending conspiracy theory. Now, at this particular moment, that stopped. People are terrified. And so let's get down to what's going to happen. Before I do that, though, I want to briefly tell you, I need you to join, like, follow, become friends with the various social media sites that we run, and you can get to it, paulmcguire.us. It is important to do this. We need to generate those numbers. You're not going to be put on a mailing list or anything else. I don't keep any computer list. We don't need to do that. But we do need you to join, like become it's free. Subscribe to the YouTube channel. Subscribe to the Roku channel. Become a member or follower of the Facebook pages. And we have like 2 Facebook pages because I started out as a private figure. We hit 5,000, which is our limit. And so now I have the public and private, and the public, unlimited numbers. Brighteon channel, Facebook, YouTube. We need you to join and like and connect with it electronically, because that generates numbers, and we need the numbers generated, as does anybody who you want to hear from, who's speaking from a Bible prophecy standpoint, a conservative point, or a biblical point, because all of our numbers are being artificially attacked. It's an attack. We're in a war. All right, so let me share that since we're in an information warfare, we need to fight this greatest battle for the hearts and minds of mankind in the history of the world, strategically, with intelligence, because we don't have much time. If the current trends continue to happen in our nation unchecked, we're going to lose our freedoms. And most importantly, you need to understand that Christianity, Christian values, conservative values will be under assault. Those ideas will be criminalized, and there will be mass arrests, mass persecution. And this is not a conspiracy theory. This is based on the historical model. There will be concentration camps and re-education camps. I very rarely say that. And I remember speaking at a Bible prophecy conference for Pastor Chuck Smith at Calvary Chapel, Costa Mesa. You can go to our Roku channel and see part of that message I gave. And when I was speaking, one of the other featured speakers was General Jerry Boykin, like the one of the founding generals of Delta Force, and the general that came to the rescue in real life in that was portrayed in the film Black Hawk Down. And General Boykin was parking his car. This is one of these God divine encounters where I was parking my car. And I walked over to him, introduced myself, We shook hands, and I just asked him a brief question. I said, you hear these rumors about these concentration camps for Christians. Do you think that there's any truth to that? Should we be concerned about that? Now, if anybody's going to know, General Boykin's going to know. And he looked at me, and his answer stunned me. He said to me, Paul, if you had asked me this question, or any general willing to talk, if you had asked us this question 10 or 20 years ago, we would not have taken that question seriously, because the only time there would be a concentration camp in America or whatever is if there would be some kind of invasion from a foreign country and we needed to arrest foreign soldiers or whatever and detain them. But then he said to me these words, and this was about 12, 15 years ago. He said to me, but now many of us, and he was speaking of himself and other very high-ranking generals, he said many of us are very concerned about these concentration camps and what they are built for. And essentially he said to me, if our country makes the wrong turn and ever succumbs to a Marxist-type revolution, he was saying, then yes, these concentration camps could very easily be used to warehouse millions of Bible-believing Christians. Now, what made that extraordinary beyond belief is that in addition to being a famous military general, General Boykin, his degree, his area of specialized training is in the area of Marxist insurgencies or Marxist revolutions that topple governments. So you can better believe that when he sees what we're all seeing now, back then and now, he recognizes it, as I do, as any of you do who recognize Marxist strategies being played out before us, that what we're seeing in the streets of America right now with the toppling of statues, with the burning of buildings, with the looting and the rioting, and these completely irrational and psychotic call to reduce the police forces in America, which is how already you can see on the news innocent people being shot. That is madness. And so that danger exists, because what is behind all this? And this is why when you analyze this, you must have knowledge, because knowledge is power. Marxism, socialism, communism, they don't originate from militant humanism or science as they pretend to come from. We must always remember that communism, Marxism, and socialism is built on spiritual and intellectual deception and lies and propaganda. After all, they say themselves, by any means necessary. So they promise a workers' paradise, they promise social justice to the masses, they promise equal jobs, they promise the total, equal, and fair distribution of wealth. They talk about excellent Medicare or medical plans for everyone. They promise great housing for everyone. They say we're going to get rid of the haves and the have-nots. And they make this utopian promises to the naive, to the uneducated, to those that don't know history. And then they recruit these people. And I understand, because I was recruited by Abby Hoffman, the radical activist, when I was 15. When I was demonstrating in the East Village, hanging out with the leaders of the counterculture. And I remember Abby Hoffman using Marxist terms like organize the discontent. And of course, they used the expression, never let a good crisis go to waste, and manufactured crisis. But manufactured crisis and the communist Marxist strategy ultimately comes from not secular humanism. It comes from Satanism, the Illuminati, and Luciferian principles and occult principles. Because what is really the occult principle behind the secular term manufactured crisis is the occult principle, order out of chaos, or new world order out of chaos. And we have to understand and remember that Karl Marx, the author of the Communist Manifesto, was a practicing Satanist, and that his sister was the head of a satanic church. And Karl Marx was financed by the occult and satanic Illuminati. Therefore, we have to understand that communism, Marxism, socialism, and the radical revolutionary politics that they create, that ultimately there is a spiritual system behind communism, Marxism, and socialism. And that spiritual system is Satanism. Now, I can prove that. I can document that from quotes and books. And that's why I encourage you to get these books as tools that will give you power, such as my latest book, The Greatest Battle for the Hearts and Minds of Mankind in the History of the World. The book before that, Conquering the Matrix, which will explain to you how a nation can be put under the spell of mind control, and how individuals such as us, if we're not careful, and especially young people, can be brainwashed by hypno-programming, and how to deprogram yourself and others. I write about in my book, Conquering the Matrix. And then, before that, Mass Awakening, how you can socially engineer a mass awakening for evil, but God also wants a mass awakening of an authentic biblical third great awakening, and what it requires to allow God to infuse a biblical third great awakening in our nation right now and win souls for Christ. And then the book, The Day the Dollar Died, which exposes how the international banking families and the globalist elite behind the coronavirus, they're hiding an economic crisis. Behind the coronavirus, they are radically restructuring our society, our families, our freedoms, using the Trojan horse of a Trojan virus. And I'm not saying, I really disagree with many of my brothers and sisters in Christ. I believe that the coronavirus is a real virus. This is not just, everybody being documented as having the coronavirus and having the common flu or cold. The coronavirus is real. I understand why and how, because in the process of writing books on Bible prophecy for the last 35 years, I've done enormous and extensive studies, and I include my research in all of the books that I've mentioned and others. Going back 35 years, I have been studying and writing specifically about biological warfare. And let's remember that the coronavirus, quote, leaked out of a level 4, that's the highest security level of a biological warfare factory in Wuhan, China. Now, you can call it whatever it is, but if a virus mysteriously, allegedly escapes from a biological warfare laboratory in Wuhan, China, wouldn't one consider rationally the high probability that what escaped from the biological warfare laboratory in Wuhan, China, was a biological warfare disease? I would. 2 months before, approximately 2 months before, 3 months before the coronavirus started to emerge in the United States and globally, my book, The Greatest Battle for the Hearts and Minds of Mankind in the History of the World, came out. And in the writing of the book, the Lord led me intensively. I had an intensive burden of the Lord to research and write on, of all things, once again, biological warfare and the rise and the relationship, or should I say the biological warfare and the increasing evidence that suggests that there's a relationship between the biological warfare weapons that could have been released on American troops when they invaded Saddam Hussein and invaded the Middle East, and even going back using different biological warfare agents on our troops in Vietnam. It could be that through exposure from the enemy's biological warfare program, there is a huge number of autoimmune diseases, things like Lyme disease, things like fibromyalgia, chronic fatigue syndrome, Crohn's disease, Parkinson's. And then there are many so-called psychiatric diseases that can be amplified, influenced, and co-travelers with the other autoimmune diseases. And these autoimmune diseases, as I document from doctors in my book, The Greatest Battle for the Hearts and Minds of Mankind in the History of the World, I list about, when you take all the psychiatric diseases and all of the, let's call them medical diseases produced, called autoimmune diseases or related to autoimmune diseases, everything from dementia to Alzheimer's to Parkinson's disease to depression and anxiety, ADD, go on and on and on, and how they're connected to the other autoimmune diseases. There's about 35 of them, many forms of arthritis, a lot of diseases that give inflammation that cause fatigue, loss of energy, or pain of various sorts. In my research, I discovered that these medical doctors discovered that there was a particular bacteria and also viruses and bacteria that they said, quote, and I'm not a medical doctor, masquerades as a virus. And they named the bacteria, which I have in the book. And they said that these bacteria, they're found in all of these autoimmune diseases. But the doctors pointed out, and I quote in my book, that the autoimmune diseases caused by this bacteria, that the bacteria and the viruses were all man-made. They were all made in biological warfare laboratories. And so there's countless millions of Americans suffering because these autoimmune diseases have spread across our nation. But the origin was biological warfare material used on our troops, or however else they acquired it, during some of our invasions in the Middle East. Now, I did intensive research in that and how 5G wireless technology, I do a lot of research on that, and this is critical in this, because as you're looking at the behavior modification going on the rioters, the demonstrators, their anger level, smashing in windows, robbing, stealing, shooting, all the rest of that, and the weird behavior by some of the cops, you have to understand that there's two potentials. Well, actually, there's a large number of potentials, but 5G wireless technology can weaken the immune system, weaken your personal electromagnetic frequency, making you more vulnerable and far more likely to catch autoimmune diseases and the coronavirus. All right, because 5G tampers with the healthy, God gave each one of us our own EMF, God DNA programmed electromagnetic frequency. And so if we're operating in the frequency that God created us to be, we're going to be healthy, harmonious, and happy. If an outside electromagnetic frequency interferes with our own electromagnetic frequency and distorts our God-given electromagnetic frequency by making it too high or too low or whatever, it can totally destroy the human immune system and the psychological state. So you have to understand that when you see, potentially, sometimes you know, propaganda, people riling each other, mob hysteria can whip people into craziness and frenzy. But you can also select any geographic area and immerse that geographic area in silent sound, or aim a wireless technology 5G weapon into a crowd of people, and you can electromagnetically make them hysterical, make them violent, make them angry, make them crazy, make them murderous, or make them docile and compliant and tired. So when you see the behavior of crowds in demonstrations, you can't absolutely know for sure what is causing the aberrant behavior. So all of these things have to be recognized, because we're in the greatest battle for the hearts and minds of mankind in the history of the world. So this battle consists of the utilization and employment of what would be called science fiction type weaponry, like 5G and EMF fields. This battle can consist of mind control technologies, brainwashing, hypnotic programming technologies, and you're seeing a synergy of that explode. In addition to that, notice the age categories of the people demonstrating and doing what they're doing. They all have one thing in common. Primarily, the age categories of all the demonstrators, they are graduates of public education, public high school, public college, where they have been brainwashed and indoctrinated for decades into hating America, into hating capitalism, into wanting Marxism and communism and socialism. So they've been incubated. They've been programmed all through their educational experience into being communist and Marxist. And they've been programmed to reject Christianity, to reject biblical truth, to reject right or wrong, so that this revolution could occur. And that's what's happening now. So, since we're in a war for the hearts and minds of mankind, since we're in the greatest battle for the hearts and minds of mankind in the history of the world, the battlefield is what the average person and young person is thinking in his or her head, what they believe, what they don't believe, what belief they're moving towards, what belief they're rejecting. And to put it brutally and bluntly, tens of millions and millions and millions of young people, right now, during the last 20 years, countless millions of young people, the product of secular education that has brainwashed them into being humanists, the products of media and entertainment that has programmed them to reject Judeo-Christian values. They have been programmed and indoctrinated like zombies, like a zombie apocalypse. And they have been psychologically maneuvered to go into a frenzy and have become pawns of a socialist Marxist revolution that is not going to make America paradise. It'll make America a prison camp. Now, how do we win this battle? Because look, here's the warning. If we lose the battle that's happening right now, because right in every war, in every spiritual war, there are certain battlefields that are pivotal to the outcome of the war. We are in such a time now. We are in a countdown to another presidential election, should that occur by God's grace. And if we look at this, it is simply not random chance and an accident that we had a whole series of regime change, coup attempt attacks designed to topple Donald Trump and his presidency and have him removed from office. This was undertaken by some of the intelligence agencies, the deep state, obviously huge sectors of the media, radical groups financed by billionaires. They have done everything in their power to impeach him, to remove him from office. And now election time has come closer, and they have failed in every single one of their attempts. They have failed. So now time is running out, and they are going to throw everything, including the kitchen sink, at the president. They're going to do everything they can to try to make sure we don't have a real election. By the way, if we have a post office mail-in ballots, that will be there are so many ways that this election can easily be rigged. Voting machines, which are owned by some of the big globalists. My research has told me that these electronic voting machines are the easiest way to rig an election because you can program them to benefit one candidate or another. On the other hand, you have mail-in ballots, which are so easy to manipulate and falsify a vote count because of the corruption of the mailing process. It just begs, if you want a distorted result or a false result, that's why everyone's pushing for like mail-in ballots using the coronavirus as a pretense. You will not have a fair election. So there is an all-out war, and you can expect it to intensify. Demonstrations, people being afraid. As we get to election day, people being afraid to go to the ballot. Demonstrators standing in front of ballot and polling places. Stealing, theft, falsifying votes. It's going to be an all-out war. And what if those in the deep state are still going to try to control the computer votes and the mail-in votes, et cetera, et cetera? In addition, after all the coup attempts failed, look at the calendar, look at the timing. The chronology leaves the fingerprints of the criminals who committed the crime. Look at the time chronology sequence of events. Several attempts at impeachment, an all-out war based on falsified information against Trump to take him out of office. And then, when all of that fails, we have a pause of about 2 weeks, and then mysteriously, we have the eruption of the coronavirus, which quickly sweeps the world, quickly spreads throughout America. And then the coronavirus, the real danger of the coronavirus is not just the medical, biological dangers, although they're real. The greater danger of the coronavirus is a Trojan horse which destroyed the U.S. economy and the global economy. The coronavirus is a Trojan horse which allows social engineering, where laws can be enacted to quarantine people in their houses. People are being hired. Right now, as you and I speak together, there are tens of thousands of people being hired, being paid anywhere from $25 to $55 or more an hour to be trackers. And what they're notice you're not seeing so much about this in the media, but as a tracker, you can make $25 to $100 or more an hour, and even higher than that, depending upon your experience. And your job is that when there's a coronavirus, people are infected and stuff. Your job is to use the surveillance technology in people's cell phones to track all their movements, to track who they visited, where they were, so they can find what caused the spread of a coronavirus. Now, nobody is against stopping the coronavirus, but this becomes a totalitarian dictatorship tool. If the government is able to hire an entire army of trackers that track your every move, everybody you talk to, every place you stopped, you see, that is surveillance on the level of a communist Chinese dictatorship. But nobody says anything because, after all, we're trying to stop the coronavirus. The coronavirus has allowed, it's the Trojan horse that has destroyed. Notice the specific target. The specific target of the coronavirus is not the giant financial corporations, the giant banks, the giant retailers, the giant car manufacturers and airlines, etc. Notice that the specific target of the coronavirus is the self-employed, the independent contractor, the waitress, the taxi cab driver, the person that owns their own small business or family business. Anything that would be considered the small business owner, especially family ownership or whatever, that is the primary target of the coronavirus. Because all of these laws, designed to block the spread of the coronavirus, one can understand from a biological level the need to have social distancing, not spread germs, etc., etc. We get that. I support that. You should support that. But it's more devious than that. Notice that what happened was that the first round of stimulus, notice that it appears that the vast majority of the massive bailout of the Federal Reserve printing endless money from nothing, notice that all the elite Federal Reserve money went primarily, once again, like it did in the 2008 financial crisis, it went to the big banks, the big investment houses, the big car companies, the big multinational corporations. The big giant corporations, they received the majority of the money. And despite all the hoopla and talk, the small business owner, the independent business owner, and we're talking about people with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 employees, and people with 200 employees or 300 employees, that's still small business. That's nothing compared to Walmart or whatever. But these other giant corporations got most of the money. And the small business owner, the independent business owner, the independent contractor, they hardly got anything. Hardly got anything. And they were buried with regulations that they couldn't complete, because it's impossible for a small business owner to put in so many precautions against the coronavirus. He or she would have to hire sometimes. I looked over all the regulations and stuff. They might have to hire 10 or 25 new employees to enforce all the sanitization laws, okay? But they never had the money to hire 10 to 20 new employees to begin with. And number two is, with all these medical procedures, which of course make sense, they have to operate in terms of cash flow like a restaurant. They have to lose voluntarily 75% of their customers in order to comply with all the social distancing requirements. So they lose 75% of their potential customers, 75% of their cash flow, and they're supposed to make a profit with only 25% of their customers or 25% of their cash flow still there. But on top of that, they're crippled with such a burden of requirements that they have to hire 10 new employees to institute all the requirements. So you have a huge need or mandate to hire new employees. to fulfill all the regulations for health, but you only have 25% of your business coming through. You'll be bankrupt in a month or two. And now, this second round of a stimulus, again, we hear the words for the small business owner, it's still being debated. The money is not going to the small business owner. Why is that important? We constantly hear how small business owners are the backbone of our economy. But we have to remember that the globalist elite, the socialists, the Marxists, and the communists despise and hate small, independent business ownership and family-owned businesses and in businesses and jobs and services owned by individuals or a family. They hate it. Why do they hate it? Because under a socialist, communist, Marxist total control system, they want the people to all work at like minimum wages, and they want them to work for these large corporations. Why? Because you cannot amass or create or generate a lot of wealth for yourself. You can't really raise your standard of living in a significant way if you're an employee of like a Walmart or all the other giant corporations. They have tightened the screws. It is usually only by being a small business owner or owning a franchise or a family or one individual. Those people have the opportunity to generate new jobs, new companies, new goods and services, and make wealth for themselves and pay their employees wealth. That's what the American dream is. But this is an attack on the American dream because in the socialist, Marxist, communist mindset, they have used psychologists, and I document all this in my book, The Greatest Battle for the Hearts and Minds of Mankind in the History of the World. They have employed psychologists who deliberately and strategically know how to manipulate an entire series of subconscious emotions, especially envy. Envy. In fact, in my book, The Greatest Battle for the Hearts and Minds of Mankind in the History of the World, I expose how the scientific and psychological application of arousing envy in any population, envy is the driving force that the communists and Marxist revolutionaries learned long ago, that by arousing envy will be the force that will cause revolution, anarchy, destruction, and the tearing down of the American system. The idea is to get millions and millions of people envious of the wealthy, and because those millions and millions of people have been dumbed down, have been programmed, they haven't been educated, they just respond to envy and bitterness and hatred. And we're not saying that in many cases there are not justifications for being angry. But when people have been abused and exploited and downtrodden and lied to, obviously they are open and vulnerable to sophisticated psychological manipulation. So, where does that bring us? You can look around all you want. There's nobody there to spread this message of truth except you and I. But remember, it only takes a tiny, tiny percentage of people in any given nation. Well, I have to understand this because this principle works for evil just as much as it works for good. And this is the principle that Christians should embrace and allow to motivate them and encourage them, because when Christians begin to perceive their external reality and the challenges we're facing through this principle, they will be empowered and motivated to change the destiny of our nation. And this is how it plays out. One of the most interesting things about historical movements is that in any given nation throughout human history, it never took a majority of people to institute massive changes, revolution, transformation. You don't need a majority of people to create massive change or even a revolution. You don't even need a lot of people. If you are deceived into thinking that all of these riots and coronavirus terror and all these pulling demonstrations and the violence, and if you see all this chaos happening on our television sets and all the fear being pumped out by the mainstream media strategically, and if you think, well, it's hopeless, look at all these millions of people, they're set about to destroy America, I better hide my head in a hole. A lot of pastors like to do that. I don't mean to be unkind, but it's true. No, you're making a false assessment. It's not the majority. History tells us it's not the majority of people in any given nation that determines the outcome, the end game, and the destiny of that nation. What the historical law and the mathematical law always show us in event after event in history is this, that a dedicated minority will always prevail over a majority, as long as that minority is totally sold out, on fire, and dedicated. It works for good or for evil. So, you can have, for example, just a dedicated 4% of any population, like a dedicated 4% of the population of the United States, that is committed to Jesus Christ, to saving souls, to occupying the land until I come, to bringing in revival. If you have in the United States of America a remnant church, a dedicated minority of only 4%, you can change the entire direction of America, because a dedicated minority will always triumph over the majority. Unfortunately, this works for evil as well. So Adolf Hitler and the Nazis, they were only 4% of the German population initially. But Hitler kept out there speaking on street corners, into small crowds and into beer halls. You see, Hitler understood, even though he was demon-possessed, he was utilizing biblical principles of productivity, which work whether you're evil or good. And so he didn't give up. There were 4% of the Nazis in Germany, but they did not give up. They kept speaking. He kept sending leaflets. He kept distributing his book. He kept speaking to small crowds. He got the backing of occult secret societies. And then the Nazis grew from 4% to 8%. And when they became 8% of the German population, that was a pivotal paradigm shift. And that only 8% of the German people who now had become dedicated Nazis, the concentration of their power and belief of 8% caused Adolf Hitler to win by a landslide the election as the head of Germany. And all the Christians voted for him, by the way, too. In communist Russia, it was only barely 4% of the Russian people wanted a communist revolution. The other 96% did not want communism. So how was it that only 4% of the Russians who were really communists were able to lead the direction and actually cause a violent revolution, the communist Russian revolution? How come they had a communist revolution when they only had 4% of the people who were communists? The other ones didn't want it. You know what happened? the globalist elite and the international bankers, as they did with Hitler, as they're doing now in America, as they did in Russia, communist Russia, as they did in China and Cuba. The Wall Street banks, that's right, you need to wake up and understand what's really going on. The Wall Street banks, the international financial institutions, the international banking families, the globalist elite, they all secretly financed Wall Street, so-called prestigious Wall Street firms that are alive today. They financed both the Germans and the Allies in World War I. It was these same super capitalists and international bankers and investment families that financed the Russian Communist Revolution. They financed the Chinese Communist Revolution. They're financing the socialist Marxist revolution going on in the United States. So you have this small minority, but it's receiving cash flow from international bankers and the wealthiest globalist elite and Luciferian families in the world. Now, this is not some little fairy tale, I'm telling you. This is what's happening in the United States of America now. That's why there's something very strange here. We supposedly have all this apparatus, this spy apparatus, after the trade towers went down. We created all this spy and intelligence apparatus to protect America from terrorism. If that is so, and I believe it is so, how is it that we never seem to catch the funding, the organizational structure of these demonstrators, of these rioters, of these radical groups like Antifa and others? These groups aren't new. The anarchists have been around for 30 years. Are you telling me that our intelligence agencies and police agencies don't have files on the cash flow, the organizational structure, the names, the warehouses, the propaganda organizations, that they don't understand this? Of course they understand it. Somebody's allowing these dogs with rabies to rip to shreds the flesh of innocent Americans. Now, I'm not talking about the demonstrators who, in their idealism, are demonstrating against racism. But you see, the communist leaders always call the idealistic demonstrators, they are called the useful idiots by the communist leaders. Okay, in my book, The Day the Dollar Died, I want to read you a couple of facts because they apply to the revolution which is going on in the streets of America right now. You're listening to the Paul McGuire Report. I'm Paul McGuire. Visit paulmcguire.us. That's paulmcguire.us. We'll be back in a moment. You're listening to the Paul McGuire Report. It's essential if you take spiritual warfare seriously, and spiritual warfare involves the effective, intelligent communication of truth. It's important for you to spread this far and wide. Why? Because we're in a battle for the hearts and minds of mankind, the greatest battle in the history of the world. And the battle that's going on is both spiritual and in the interior of people's minds. People are being bombarded with thoughts, ideas, opinions, and perceptions through the mainstream media, through entertainment, through people they know, through music, through propaganda, through the media, which is all controlled by the globalist elite. All the mainstream media is. And they see propaganda image after propaganda image over and over again. And so that's just a fancy way of saying they're being brainwashed. By who? Well, let's look at reality. This is something you'll never learn in economics at the university level. I didn't. But as I began to, but it's interesting what the reading of one book can do to change a person's life. Now, I'm not talking about the Bible. The Bible is the most important book I have ever read and the most important book that you can distribute, assuming you can get people to read it. But the old adage, the pen is mightier than the sword, is still true today. Don't be deceived. Social media, the internet, video, and all of these internet digital technologies, virtual reality, artificial intelligence, bots, or whatever, all of those are very powerful communication, brainwashing tools. But never forget the old expression that content is king. Content is king. That means you can have all the social media you want. You can have, amplifiers, satellites to communicate your message. But if the content of your message is not clear and it doesn't have power, then all the billions you may be spending on communications technology is not really going to be effectual unless the content has power in it. And what do I mean by that? The content has to be truth. The most powerful content is not cleverly presented lies. That will work, but it won't decide who wins or loses the spiritual battlefield. Content is king. So when we have content that is biblically true, logically and rationally and intelligently connected to a biblical worldview, and by that I'm not talking about a counterfeit super spirituality where people actually celebrate. It's actually blasphemous. They celebrate stupidity, ignorance, and a lack of education as if that was a sign of true spirituality. That is a perversion of true spirituality. Knowledge is power. The culture, the group of people, any group, any family, any people, any community, any nation that does not have knowledge and does not have power will be made slaves, placed into captivity, and they will be conquered. Ultimately, the only thing that keeps us from being conquered at this very moment is, first of all, the unmerited favor, the grace of Almighty God, whose hand is still upon this nation. But also, there must be among God's people an embracing of the truth, which is knowledge, which produces power. When God's people can walk not in emotionalism, but in power, intellectual power, idea power, because ideas have consequences. You see, if you're basing your strategy on an idea that is contradictory to the truth, you're going to have an end game which fails. You will be defeated. Content is king. Therefore, if you're going to have a strategy, it has to be based on truth and a proper and correct understanding of the truth. Therefore, then, your content is based and birthed from truth. So when that content is released in any environment, and I'm talking about the environment of the spiritual realm, the environment of people's minds and thoughts and beliefs and perceptions, the environment of the cultural mind, when the power of contents is released into any dimension, it reshapes and reconfigures that dimension for good or for evil. See, what is propaganda? What is mind control? What is hypnotic programming? What is advertising? What is social engineering? And I talk about all of this in my books, which you should consider as volumes and get all of the volumes. Because you've got you have to pay a price to get knowledge. You have to read to get knowledge. There's no shortcut, and it doesn't have to be boring. So Again, a primary goal of Paul McGuire Ministries and Paradise Mountain Church is to use every media, internet, social media, technological, book, conference, Paradise Mountain Church meetings, everything we can to communicate the powerful content of truth and infuse it in our culture and in the hearts and minds of people. But propaganda and social engineering and hypnosis and brainwashing and advertising, what they do is they actually echo the strategy of Lucifer or the serpent of old in the Garden of Eden. They mix truth with lies. And that's the seduction that brings people into deception. So let's talk about content for a moment. Content is truth. You heard me make a series of statements. Now, the question you should ask yourself is, before dismissing anything that I've said, if you've dismissed what I said, you're probably not even listening. So what you've done is you've arrived at a premature conclusion without properly examining the content, and in some cases, people walk away in deception. God holds them responsible for that. So let's look at content. Content is truth. Let's look at historical truth regarding the American money system, which controls the global money system. In my book, The Day the Dollar Died, you'll recognize the cover of my book, The Day the Dollar Died, because you'll see a girl with like green eyes and a barcode on her forehead. And you will say, gee, I've seen that picture of this girl with a barcode on her forehead. I've seen this all over the place. I've even seen The Day the Dollar Died. But what you won't know is that when I published this book, which came out in the copyright is 2009, it went on hundreds of thousands of websites, literally, the cover did. But on top of that, a lot of people literally ripped off the cover art of my book, The Day the Dollar Died, stole the girl's face, stole the barcode, in some cases stole the words, The Day the Dollar Died, and in most cases, not all, there's some people with integrity, they would literally crop out Paul McGuire because they wanted to, people I know, people who are my friends. I don't have any bad feelings towards them because why? I don't know. In some cases, I think it's innocent. In some cases, I think it's lack of integrity. In any case, you'll say, hey, I recognize this book cover. Yeah, you will, because you've seen this book cover probably on millions of websites, and the vast majority of them, they simply ripped off the artwork. I laugh because I get people, I don't mind when people quote me and stuff like that, or even it's great if people show a cover of my book. It helps sell the book. But when people steal and plagiarize, I really don't like it. So let's go into the content of The Day the Dollar Died. I talk about the Federal Reserve System and in the middle class. And I want to make this short, but the Federal Reserve System came about in the United States with the passage of the Federal Reserve Act in 1913, okay? And what happened then, that was a financial coup. Our media never talks about it. As many of you know, I was a guest on the Fox News Network and the Fox Business Channel constantly for about 10 years until they changed formats. I was one of the conservative radio talk show hosts that would debate others. And I was on the biggest shows of Fox and extremely popular. And there was fireworks whenever I was on. And I made my argument articulately with research. And but one thing I always remember, and that was going on CNN also, which I went on quite a bit. Nobody ever tells you can't say this. You never sign something. You're never told what you can say or cannot say. But you have to be able to perceive the unspoken rules, the unseen lines. And it was obvious to me that when we discussed the Federal Reserve, the unspoken rule was you can talk about the Federal Reserve, but you can't really explain in fullness the secret of the Federal Reserve. Okay, so that was what it still is. So many people don't know what the Federal Reserve is. So when the Federal Reserve guy came on television a couple of months ago in response to the coronavirus and said they're going to just keep printing money endlessly, that was really an honest admission of what they've been doing all along. The Federal Reserve, in its simplest terms, was not how our monetary system in the United States worked. In the United States, according to the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, we the people, and our elected representatives have the power to print our own money, to loan our own money, to create interest rates, et cetera, et cetera. So only we the people and the Congress can print money and control the U.S. monetary system. That meant that was the way we kept free. You see, in contrast, Europe, Britain, and the other nations of Europe were under a different system, which they called the central banks. The central banks were banks that were owned by the international banking families like Rothschild, and the central banks that dominated and controlled all the European nations also controlled the politicians and the governments. America was supposed to be different because we were free. We, the people, were supposed to control our monetary system and not some kind of Rothschild central bank. Well, they knew central bank was a dirty word in America, so in 1913, they promoted what was called the Federal Reserve Act. Well, the Federal Reserve Act was just a ploy to bamboozle and get rid of our we, the people, controlled U.S. money and turn the control, the printing of money, the interest rates, and turn the control and ownership of our entire financial system and give it to approximately 12 international banking families, many of whom were foreign. So all of a sudden, after the passage of the Federal Reserve Act, which was promoted by both the Republicans and the Democrats, using slightly different names, I think it was Christmas Eve towards midnight, the Federal Reserve Act was passed in 1913. And from that moment on, our U.S. monetary system is no longer owned by Congress, the U.S. government, or we the people. Our entire monetary system, including the printing of money and setting of interest rates, is now owned by a secretive private group of international banking families like Rothschild, Rockefeller, etc. And they control the money system. That was the greatest coup in U.S. history. Because as Rothschild said, I don't care who's president or prime minister. He said, whoever controls the money controls the country. And Rothschild boasted, because I control the money system, I also control the political system. And he was correct. So in 1913, the Federal Reserve Act was passed, along with the Federal Reserve System. They're still in operation today. It is illegal for the United States government or the American people to really do a truthful, investigative accounting of how much money the Federal Reserve has, where it loans money, where it spends money, where it prints money, when it raises interest rates, when it lowers interest rates, when it artificially and scientifically creates inflation or deflation. There were warnings by people back when they were involved in this takeover of the U.S. via the financial system. There were people that criticized it. So, when we go back, I'm reading to you from The Day the Dollar Died. You can get it at paulmcguire.us. It's available at a discount, and you should get it in a bundle with other books. So, from my book, The Day the Dollar Died, when the Federal Reserve was first established, I'm writing on page 94 of my book, members of the Federal Reserve. So, when it was first established, The 10 primary stockholders in the Federal Reserve at its beginning were: number 1, the Rothschild family of London; number 2, the Rothschilds of Berlin; number 3, the Lazard brothers, Paris; number 4, Israel Schiff, Italy; number 5, Kuhn Loeb Company, Germany; number 6, the Warburgs, Amsterdam; number 7, the Warburg family, Hamburg; number 8, Lehman Brothers, New York; number 9, Goldman and Sachs, New York; number 10, the Rockefellers. Now, what is interesting is that the Federal Reserve Bank began in 1913. And what is also interesting is that many of the American politicians warned and spoke out about it. So, for example, and I'm quoting to you from my book, The Day the Dollar Died, Congressman Louis T. McFadden, a Republican of Pennsylvania, in 1932, he was the president of the First National Bank and chairman of the Committee on Banking on Currency. He said this, quote, "When the Federal Reserve Act was passed, the people of the United States did not perceive that a world banking system was being set up here, a superstate controlled by international bankers and industrialists acting together to enslave the world. Every effort has been made to conceal the powers, but the truth is the Fed has usurped the government." All right. Notice that none of the mainstream media ever tells you this. In all the shows that I appeared on, not once was this kind of full disclosure made. I could have made it, but guess what would have happened if I started to tell the truth in the Federal Reserve? I would have been politely, "Nice to have you today, Paul McGuire. Keep up the good work." Boom. I would have been out of there and probably never invited back again. Because you just know the unspoken rules. You're not allowed to go there. So, what's interesting is this man is speaking in very strong terms in 1932. How come so many Christians? This was in the mainstream papers in 1932. Why is it that so many Christians in America, evangelical Christians, think, and just Americans, think that a superstate controlled by the international bankers and industrialists acting together to enslave the world, which was made by a prominent congressman and a prominent banker? I mean, these people were criticizing this monstrosity way back in the 1930s. Now, we constantly hear, President Obama called for a new area of transparency and accountability in our nation's economic system. Oh, really? What happened with that? Charles Lindbergh Sr. said in 1913, he saw this coming in 1913, and Charles A. Lindbergh Sr. said, quote, "From now on, depressions will be scientifically created." And then I comment, Lindbergh was saying that the Federal Reserve System would create a series of depressions, recessions, and crises in order to achieve their ends. What are their ends? A one-world socialist government. That's their ends. And then I write, Congressman Lindbergh continued with his comments on the Federal Reserve Act by adding, quote, "This new law will create inflation whenever the trusts want inflation. They can unload stocks on people at high prices during the excitement and then bring on a panic and buy them back at low prices. The day of reckoning is only a few years removed." Now, President Woodrow Wilson, who was deceived for a great deal of his presidency, was used by the globalists and the communists and the socialists. And President Woodrow Wilson signed the Federal Reserve Act in 1913. Now, you'll never hear this printed or talked about in the mainstream media. But after signing the Federal Reserve Act in 1913, President Woodrow Wilson said these words, quote, "I am a most unhappy man. I have unwittingly ruined my country. A great industrial nation is controlled by its system of credit. Our system of credit is concentrated in the hands of a few men. Growth of the nation, therefore, and all our activities are in the hands of a few men. We have come to one of the worst ruled, one of the most completely controlled and dominated governments in the civilized world. No longer a government of free opinion, no longer a government by conviction and vote of the majority, but the government by the opinion and duress of a small group of dominant men." I mean, these are like bone-chilling words. So, and then, of course, Kennedy spoke out about this secret control of the United States of America through the financial system. He spoke out several times a month before he was assassinated brutally. Now, a point that I want to make is that these international bankers own all of the mainstream media. So what is happening now is they did not plan this, and what I'm saying now is not a political statement. It's an analysis of economics and what's happening. It was completely unexpected that Donald Trump would win. Donald Trump won the presidency. But Donald Trump is and continues to be a major threat to the leaders of the New World Order, the international bankers, and the globalist elite. He's a threat because what he promotes and stands for is in opposition to what their goals are. So, for example, the international globalist elite want a giant one world government, a one world economic system, and a one world religion so they can have total control, total mass surveillance through a chip implant, and a total socialist dictatorship. And the reason super capitalists always want a socialist communist dictatorship is that's the best way for them to get total control over any nation or of any people group. Well, Trump is in opposition to this. Trump wants to make America great again. Trump wants to harness the working power of the working class and the middle class and allow them to rise in prosperity, build their own businesses, pass on money from generation to generation, and increase their economic prosperity. The people of the New World Order don't want that. They want people to be victims. They want to divide and conquer. They want there to be race wars. They want socialism because what they want is unquestioning slaves to their New World Order. But in order to sucker punch the uneducated masses, they promise them the same old garbage of a workers' paradise and social justice and great jobs for everybody, all of which never happens. So in the book, The Day the Dollar Died, I continue to give authoritative, documented facts of what's really happening. And what's really happening, this is what I wanted to bring up to you, and I talk quite a bit about it in my book, The Day the Dollar Died. The financiers of Adolf Hitler's Nazi Germany, they were financed by Wall Street banking families and Wall Street banks. That's very unpleasant, but it's true. I document the banks. I document all of this in my book, The Day the Dollar Died. So Wall Street and the international bankers financed both the Nazis and Adolf Hitler, but then they financed America and Great Britain and the other nations that fought the Nazis in World War II. So we had millions of people dying for a war of which the international bankers were secretly financing both sides of the war because war is massive big business for the international bankers. Think about what a obscenity that is. The same thing happened with the Russian Communist Revolution. Again, as I said before, only 4% of the Russians wanted a communist revolution. But the international bankers financed the communist revolution in Russia. And they spent millions and millions, and they sent trains in with guns and ammunition. And since the Russians wanted nothing to do with communism, the international bankers paid their communist revolutionaries for hire money, and they went out and hired ex-prison convicts, criminals, and thugs to be their on-the-ground communist revolutionaries. So the communist revolution that occurred in Russia didn't happen because of a people uprising. It happened because the international bankers financed the guns and the criminals who would become their shock troops to cause one city after another to eventually fall to a brutal communist revolution. So what am I explaining here? I'm exposing the fact that in these global conflicts and in these communist revolutions, that they are secretly financed by the super capitalists and the international banking elite. Okay, so now we fast forward to the revolution going on in the streets of America today. Who's financing all these demonstrations, all these riots, all these statues being pulled down? Who's financing it? The same international bankers that financed Hitler, that financed the communist revolution, are secretly financing the riots in the streets, the demonstrations, the Occupy Wall Streets, Antifa, and the whole thing. But all the so-called revolutionary popular uprising you're seeing in the streets of America that's designed to, again, pull Trump out of office is being secretly financed by the international globalist bankers. That's what you're up against. Now, one further note of warning. These communist, globalist financed revolutionaries that are highly trained, the leaders, the masses are just puppets. They have penetrated so many Christian denominations, so many evangelical churches, and so many evangelical seminaries that internally the evangelical church, which was once a Bible-believing church, has now been secretly brainwashed and indoctrinated into communist Marxist ideology. In what form? I explain all of this simply in my book, The Greatest Battle for the Hearts and Minds of Mankind in the History of the World. They use a communist principle called critical theory. Critical theory was developed by the Frankfurt School in 1920. A bunch of communist professors who plotted and planned to ignite a communist revolution in America and Western European nations through cultural revolution, like political correctness, like critical theory, etc., etc. When Hitler rose to power, all these communist professors had communist connections in the United States, and they were assigned they were made tenured professors of our Ivy League schools, and the most prestigious educational colleges and universities in America were populated by communist professors who had a long-term goal of igniting a cultural communist revolution in the United States. That is now coming to fruition before our very eyes. But in addition to that, the same mechanism they used to weaken and dismantle the Bible-believing evangelical church of Germany just before Hitler took over, which was the German theological schools of higher criticism, they employed higher criticism, also known as critical theory, is now being used. It's embraced by the Southern Baptists. It's embraced by other evangelical churches and seminaries. And I will say this, and I don't mean to be unkind. I don't mean to sound disparaging. But I think it's an abomination before God that so many of God's pastors and ministers and seminaries and denominations are literally teaching their people to read things developed by communist critical theory, such as critical race theory, which the Southern Baptist as a denomination embraced, and so many other evangelical denominations. How do I know? I looked up their studies and their programs, and they're inviting Marxist professors who are teaching critical theory to educate entire denominations and churches in how to have a racial reconciliation. That is, they have been subverted. None of us want racism. All of us want a racial reconciliation. But you don't use communist theories and communist techniques like critical race theory, which is simply a Marxist Trojan horse, to penetrate and surpass biblical truth. And one can only say that there is an accountability. I'm not God. Thank God. You should thank God, and I should thank God that I'm not God. But we are all accountable to God, including me. But to be a Christian leader whom God has placed as the head of a denomination or a major seminary or a major Christian church or whatever, and because of your own ignorance, because you decided to reject knowledge, because you decided to reject wisdom and truth, and as a consequence, you thus lack the discernment to see the poison of critical theory or critical race theory coming into your churches. And because you rejected knowledge, you rejected the knowledge that the men who invented critical theory were militant communists, and these were the goals. The very communists from the Frankfurt School who developed critical theory or critical race theory are the same communist professors who itemized these four things as their most important goals. And I'm going to quote to you, I have it listed in my book, The Greatest Battle. I'm going to quote to you the four most important goals promoted by the Marxist professors behind critical theory in order of what they say is the most important. Their number one goal, in their own words, is to destroy the Christian religion. Their number two goal, in their own words, is to destroy the Christian family unit or marriage. Their number three goal is to destroy any concept of a moral right and a moral wrong, or an absolute right and an absolute wrong. And their number four goal is to destroy the national sovereignty and patriotism to the United States of America. Now, all of those are serious goals. But the very fact that the number one goal of the Frankfurt School Marxists who developed critical race theory, which the entire Southern Baptist and many other evangelical denominations have now embraced, the indictment is this: why would you invite the creators of critical race theory, which is nothing more than a mechanism for your stated goal? They have gone on record in endless books, endless publications, stating that their number one goal is to destroy biblical Christianity. So how does a Christian leader, a minister, a seminarian, a professor, a denominational head, the Southern Baptists, really, in my opinion, their acceptance of critical race theory is the most egregious violation of biblical truth that I have seen in my lifetime. I am a theological and intellectual disciple of the teachings of Dr. Francis Schaeffer, the greatest evangelical theologian in the last 100+ years. He rebuked with great eloquence the evangelical denominations, including the Southern Baptists, for their backsliding 35 years ago, for their rejection of biblical truth in favor of humanistic philosophies. He rebuked them 35 years ago. And yet, they have not learned. They have become stiff-necked, hardened their hearts, and the very fact that the largest evangelical denomination in the United States of America is promoting and indoctrinating their youth with critical theory, a critical race theory, which has been developed by a Marxist professor using the pretense that, we're going to have racial reconciliation if we teach and practice critical race theory, when nothing can be further from the truth. The purpose of critical race theory has nothing to do with race. That is just the excuse to launch a cultural revolution that will destroy all biblical Christian denominations, seminaries, schools, and churches. In the same way that the first wave of critical theory, launched by the Frankfurt School Marxists, took place in Germany, when all the people in Germany who wanted to be pastors and wanted a Christian education, or even just ordinary people who wanted a degree in Christian Bible study and theology, attended what were called the German theological schools of higher criticism, which were obviously developed by the Frankfurt School Marxist professors. And what would happen is that the Frankfurt School Marxist professors very cleverly put through all these Christian pastors, denominational heads, and Christians through an educational process which essentially deconstructed and ripped apart in shreds through hypercriticism of the Bible. So theological higher criticism is a fancy way of saying they use criticism as a hammer to smash to pieces the Bible, because it's not honest criticism, it's falsified criticism. And so what happened is all the pastors and the Christians who went to the German schools of theological higher criticism ended up being atheists, agnostics, or getting involved in the occult, because they were indoctrinated into rejecting Jesus. They specialized in tearing apart any belief in the virgin birth of Jesus Christ, the resurrection of Christ, the second coming of Christ, the miracles of Christ. They basically destroyed the book, giving place for the spirit of Antichrist to invade Germany. And Adolf Hitler, a militant occultist promoted by occult secret societies, rose to power. So right now, that is a primary battlefield. So what you're seeing now, in terms of chronology, is due to the fact that an election is coming up very quickly. This is all about destroying nationalism, destroying a Judeo-Christian philosophy in the United States of America. This is all about destroying the national sovereignty of the United States and making the United States part of a socialist global government. Ultimately, this is far more than just Trump has to be removed, because Trump, whether you like him or not, has been the greatest champion, despite his obvious inconsistencies, despite his obvious moral failings and imperfections. President Donald Trump has ironically been the greatest and strongest defender of biblical Christianity and biblical values of any president in the history of the United States of America. And if they can remove him, they can strike with a vengeance to obliterate and destroy all forms of biblical Christianity. And if you think that all this surveillance technology and this contact tracing of using cell phones to trace whether you talk to somebody with the coronavirus, all of these will be used as a Chinese communist credit score totalitarianism. You will and I will see Brave New World open up before us. Now, I'm going to do a second part to this message. because all is not lost. But if we do not seize the time, and I'm talking about the time in terms of seconds, and if each one of us, the only thing that will release the power of God to change the direction of our nation right now, if each person, if every one of us listening would simply present ourselves to the Lord and ask the Lord to use us, and if we would begin to pray for our nation and repent of our sins and be the loving agents of Jesus Christ, we have a window of time to turn this around. Why? Because we have access to the supernatural power, the keys of the kingdom that Jesus Christ has given us. We have the spiritual power to turn this around. But the window of time is of the essence. We really don't have much time. Anyone who deceives themselves and thinks that things are going to go back to normal, forget about new normal, old normal. Their plan, new normal, is code for socialist, humanist, brave new world dictatorship with a smile. That's what it is. And if you can't figure it out, I don't know what to tell you. In any case, have courage and stand strong. You were called to be here for such a time as this. You were called to be a bearer of the light of Jesus Christ. Together, whether we're just 4% or 8%, God has given us the power to turn the tide of this nation. But that means that you and I must be fully engaged in the loving, peaceful, spiritual battle at hand. And therefore, we need to come together to pray for one another, to pray for ministries and people and Christians who are standing up for Jesus. I need your prayers for this ministry, for myself and my family. I will tell you bluntly and directly, without your prayers, I can't accomplish anything. Your prayers have enormous significance. So I must have your prayers, because I am acutely aware that no man has the intellectual, the personality power. No man can be God. I am dependent upon the power of God. And then I thank you, and I thank those of you that will receive the burden of the Holy Spirit that so many of us have received. And as a consequence, you're willing to spread these messages with our video messages, audio messages, books, communications far and wide, by sending links and doing an end run around the evil big tech censorship. And then finally, when you engage in spiritual warfare and you move out offensively to take more territory, in our case, that means we need to expand our studio, expand the technological capacity of our studio. We need to expand the technological capacity of the television part of it, the video part of it, the radio part of it, the internet part of it. And we are already in the process of building counter social media platforms as a proactive strategic measure. Because if they knock out one internet, there will be a secondary internet available. You want to be ready to go. The same thing with if they shut down huge parts of the internet, which they've already done. Through censorship and bots, we have alternative platforms, alternative sites, alternatives, so that the message of the gospel, the winning of souls, and the proclaiming of the truth of the entire Bible can move forward unrestricted. I need your help to do that more than ever before. The level of the battle is more intense than ever before for you, for me, and for every Christian attempting to live for Jesus Christ. So I ask you to go before the Lord in prayer and simply ask the Lord, present your life to him and say, Jesus, I give you my life. I want to be your servant, your man, or your woman. There's nothing more freeing than when you truly dedicate your heart, your soul, your mind, your life to Jesus. It doesn't mean you're going to be perfect. That's a delusion. It means you'll be forgiven, but you can be completely dedicated to Jesus, completely committed to Jesus. You don't have to be afraid of taking that spiritual step in prayer. You know why? A lot of people confuse being perfect with being qualified to be used by God or committing their lives to God. That's a lie of the devil. You will never be perfect. You're not perfect now. I'm not perfect now. We are all sinners saved by grace. We endeavor to be perfect, but there's not a single one of us after we endeavor to be perfect where we don't miss the mark. All of us miss the mark on a daily basis. And so we must resist the temptation to be egregiously self-righteous and condemn people for this sin or that sin, because that may be not the sin that is a problem for us. So we point the finger at others. We may not all deal with this sin or that sin because we're all different. Certain sins are far more tempting to this individual or that individual than they would be to this individual or that individual. That doesn't make one more virtuous than the other. The point is, being fully used in the service of God doesn't mean you're perfect. And if you think that's what it means, you're headed for a nervous breakdown. What does it say in the book of Revelation? They overcame him, Satan, by the blood of the Lamb and the word of their testimony. The key is that you dedicate your life to God. You give your life to God. Okay? You give your talents and your abilities to God. You give your money, your resources, and your gifts to God. You give your life to God's service, and God will use you. God will anoint you. God will do supernatural things through you. But it's not about you being perfect, because you will never be perfect. You strive to be perfect. That's your goal. And when you miss the mark, which you will, you ask Jesus to cleanse you with his blood, and he cleanses you of all sin. And then you're made perfect in the eyes of God by faith. And therefore you can proceed in victory. You don't allow the devil to knock you out of the spiritual battle. So there are people listening to me right now. I want to tell you something. This is a word from the Lord. Be careful. Don't allow the devil to knock you out of the spiritual battle when, first of all, the devil and his evilness will tempt you to sin. Then you respond to the devil's temptation and you sin. That doesn't mean you're not responsible. You are. You made the choice. But then the devil who tempted you to sin is the same one who condemns you and lies to you and tells you you can never be used by God. You can never be blessed by God because you sinned. That's nonsense. You ask God for forgiveness. You ask God for the supernatural power to overcome sin and temptation or whatever you're dealing with. That is the victorious Christian life, not the absence of challenges and temptations. And so God is calling you now. But some of you feel disqualified. Some of you feel like you can never be used by God. Some of you feel like you're always second-class citizens. Some of you feel like, you're not quite spiritual enough. And there's always this sense of condemnation hanging over you because it's this, that, or the other. And the devil can take the most... Look, smoking is bad for your health. We know that. It can kill you. But smoking, in terms of your spiritual life purely, if you smoke a cigarette, you're not going to hell. So there's some Christians, the devil will magnify any sin and weakness you have, and he will condemn you on it. So there's people, because they sin, or they curse, or whatever it is, they think, well, God can never use them. That's a lie. That's a total lie. Don't allow the devil to disqualify you with his lies when God has qualified you with his blood. So you come to the Lord and you pray. You say, Lord Jesus Christ, I commit my life to you. You confess your sins. You ask to be cleansed with his blood. And then you ask to be filled with his Holy Spirit. You ask to be filled with his wisdom. And then you give your life to the Lord, your talents and abilities and your resources. But you acknowledge that they're his. And then when you pray to God, for example, those of you that pray for this ministry, we're thankful for, you ask God, how can I partner with Paradise Mountain Church and Paul McGuire Ministries? And you ask the Lord. You don't fake it like you ask the Lord. You really ask the Lord. Because if you fake asking the Lord, and I'm not here to manipulate or condemn you, that habit of faking spirituality before the Lord will become your norm. And before you know it, you're going to be way out in deception. That may take some years, but that's how it starts. No, you don't fake it. You don't put on a show before the Lord. You can see through it anyway. You go to the Lord and say, Lord, how can I help financially with contributions and donations? How much do you want me to give, Lord? And then you wait upon the Lord. Or you might say, Lord, I really would like to give a gift to help Paul expand the ministry and the studio and the outreach. Ask the Lord for extra monies. Ask the Lord to bless you so that you can funnel blessing and make a donation to this ministry, Paul McGuire Ministries and Paradise Mountain Church. Ask the Lord to specifically bless you over and above. And what you'll find is if your heart's right and you ask the Lord to bless you over and above, then when the Lord does bless you over and above, you remember what you said to the Lord and what you prayed to the Lord, and you keep your commitment to the Lord, and then you obey the Lord and you give the donation or the contribution to our ministry that you said you would do. But this is what you'll find. The Lord rewards the integrity and the obedience of our hearts. And because you're asking the Lord for extra monies so you can make a donation or a contribution on a level that you'd like to this ministry, the Lord honors your integrity of heart and will often give you unexpected monies and sums and resources way beyond what you expected, way beyond what you asked God you needed to give. In other words, God is blessing your prayer because you weren't just praying for yourself, you were praying for something that will move forward the kingdom of God. So God is not only giving you the extra monies to donate to this ministry or whatever God calls you to donate to, God gives you over and above because the integrity of your heart has blessed him. And guess what? You find that you yourself are supernaturally prospered financially and materially over and above you asked for. Because your heart was right. It's not all about you, see? You're blessed. And you discover the kingdom principle of growth, faithfulness, and then growth. So I want to encourage you with that. We are at a pivotal moment. And each one of us has a part. And I want to encourage you to pray that prayer. Last night, because last night was July 4th, I devoted several segments of the day to pray and seek the Lord regarding America, as I have been doing ever since I had a vision on July 4th, 2012. So I pray, I repent, I give myself to the Lord. And I cannot tell you the intensity of I have never had an intensity of a burden so great as I've had for this nation in the last several months. But during this 4th of July period and on the 4th of July when I was praying, I can't ever recall having a burden of such intensity and painfulness of the urgency of the hour. The urgency of the hour. Especially when I saw a picture, I believe the picture was taken months ago, but on one of the social media, I saw a picture of, I think it was Washington State, and it was in the government building of Washington State, and Satanists were having an out in the open ceremony in the interior of the government building of the government of the state of Washington. And you saw all these Satanists standing unabashedly in their black robes, invoking and performing some kind of public satanic ritual. And my heart just broke, because what I saw was the Satanists going on the offensive, the Satanists serving their god, Lucifer, with more passion than most of God's people give the true God, Jesus Christ. I mean, it's heartbreaking when you see that. Not all, there's a remnant church, but it's heartbreaking when you see dedicated Satanists dressed in black, occupying the land of the government of the state of Washington, unabashedly promoting Satanism, fearlessly promoting Satanism. It breaks your heart, because there are many Christians who are equally and more sold out to Jesus. But I must say, I suspect that the average Christian is nowhere near as dedicated to Jesus as so many of these Satanists are to Lucifer. And I repented for that as an intercessory prayer warrior. So, greater is he that is in you than he that is in the world. It is possible to change this around, but I'm telling you with all my heart, and it sounds redundant, but the clock is ticking. I mean, the clock is really at the midnight hour. You see that picture of me, I deliberately put on the back of my book, The Greatest Battle for the Hearts and Minds of Mankind in the History of the World. And I've posted that same picture on different social media accounts, our Facebook accounts and stuff. It's a picture of me standing under the clock in Grand Central Station in Manhattan, and it's midnight. And I don't want to go into how we took that picture, but there's something prophetic in that. I mean, this is it, man. This is it. So let's seize the time. God bless you, your brother in Christ, Paul McGuire. Visit paulmcguire.us. That's paulmcguire.us. And remember, Jesus is Lord.